And Miles, let me know when you're ready for to admit everyone from the waiting room.
Okay. I just want to make sure I don't get that feedback loop. So I'm in my browser and I have paused the live stream. I guess it was coming through the browser on replay or on play.
Right. So you can either close the tab that has YouTube or you can mute the YouTube live stream.
Okay, that's it. I've closed the tab. So,
okay,
that should work. And then let's go ahead and let everybody in. And welcoming everybody here now for the wonderful and auspicious presentation by Geshe Thupten Jinpa on the distinctive features of Tantra. We're just going to wait a couple minutes to let everybody file in, and please let's set our motivation. And we hope that Catherine will join us too and lead us into some prayers. Nice to see everybody's faces. Wonderful. There's Mary in Alaska. Hi, Mary. Okay. Okay, just a few more minutes and we'll just let people file in. If you have, if you're darked out, it would be great to see your face, if possible, if you have the video capability to do that. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Take a nice deep breath. And do feel that you're in the presence of great living masters and great living beings surrounding us and guiding us through the period of COVID. And that we're totally not alone. And that green Tara is with us. And that green Tara is within each of us. And Geshe Tenzin Zopa is with us. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is with us. Geshe Thupten Jinpa is actually with us. And so feel very, very fortunate to be surrounded by all your Dharma friends and brothers and sisters across the planet. Sangye chodan sogni chonam la jangdu badu dakni kyabsu ji daki jen yogi bezo nam ki drola penche sangye drupa shu Sangye chodan sogni chonam la jangdu badu dakni kyabsu ji daki jen yogi bezo nam ki drola penche sangye drupa shu Sangye jodan sogne chonam la jangdu badu dakni gyabsu ji daki jinso gibe sunam ge drolat benju sangye drupashu. and on the basis of our reflection, study, and practice, do generate the altruistic wish that all the activities that we do together may it be of sincere benefit to all living beings, especially during this time of COVID. And let me just take a few minutes of your time to kindly introduce our special guest, Geshe Thupten Jinpa, who is a very esteemed scholar, and we're so privileged and honored to receive him for the Contemplative Studies program. Geshe Lao is a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, former monk, and academic of religious studies, and both Eastern and Western philosophy. He is best known, of course, as the principal English translator of His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 1985. He has translated and edited more than 10 books by the Dalai Lama, as well as his own books, most recently A Fearless Heart and the biography of Tsongkhapa. Jinpa La is also an incredibly proficient scholar in his own right and has been on the vanguard of both preservation and innovation of Tibetan Buddhism in the West for the past 30 years. He was trained at Ganden Monastery in South India, where he earned his Geshe Larampa. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's the highest honor one can be bestowed in graduation. He later earned a BA and a PhD in religious studies from Cambridge University and is currently a professor at McGill University. He is established and is the president of the Institute of Tibetan Classics, where he endeavors to translate the works of the Indian and Tibetan masters. Our group had the great fortune of reading his translation of Chekawa's 7-point mind training last semester. In addition, he has served as the founding board member of the Mind Life Institute since its inception, which features annual dialogues between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Western scholars and scientists. Finally, Jinpa La is on the advisory board at Stanford's Center for Compassion and Altruistic Research and Education, CCARE, where he helped design a compassion-based meditation protocol for well-being. Sorry to embarrass him with such a long bio, but one point I wanted to get across to us is, if there is at any point ever any doubt that we are surrounded by great masters in the contemporary age, then that should be dispelled, because Geshe Thupten Jinpa, in my view, is like one of the great pundits of Nalanda University. He is like Chandrakirti in our time. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama is like Lama Tsongkhapa in our time. And so we should really feel incredibly fortunate, and we shouldn't have this kind of feeling that we're in a degenerate age and that we're just sort of limping along and that there's no chance for us. There are truly realized beings like Geshe Tenzin Zopa and Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, great masters, great yogis, and that we should feel very, very fortunate and very inspired that we are blessed and led and guided in this sort of transmission of Dharma to the West. So without further ado, Geshe Thupten Jinpa, thank you so much.
I can't.
You're muted there. Now I've unmuted. Okay,
okay.
You're good.
Good. Let me switch on my light first. Okay. Good evening, everybody. For some of you, it might be good night. For some of you, it might be good morning. So, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to spend this evening with you. And at the beginning, I would like to thank Dr. Miles, Neale, and Alison for inviting me. And when I received the invitation from Alison, I was a little intrigued because she sent me the syllabus that you have been following. And I was very impressed by the systematic structure of that progression. And I immediately dropped a note saying, yes, Tantra is not something that I normally talk about, but for this group, yes, I'll do it. So thank you all. And, I hope that you're all keeping well. As, Miles reminded us, we're living in a very, very uncertain time. And the COVID situation has really aggravated, particularly the suffering of, the the less fortunate ones across the world and in one's own country as well. So as we enjoy these kind of privileges to be able to delve deeper into the wisdom and teachings of the Buddhist tradition, let's also remind ourselves that one of the principal values of a Bodhisattva path is to always remember others, particularly those who are less fortunate, those who are suffering. So let's remember them, and as much as possible, in small ways or in big ways, see if part of our life could be at least spent on trying to help someone. You know, some of us may be in a position to help more, some of us may be in a position to help less, but we can always make a difference in someone's life. I think that is very important, because sometimes in the, His Holiness once said that I remember as a kid when I was attending his teachings, and the one thing that really stayed in my mind, I was about 11 in Dharamsala at the time, was he said that we all pray in the morning, all mother sentient beings, and we raised our eyebrows and we try to go deeper into this aspiration. But he said that sometimes we act as if the mother sentient beings for whom we are praying are somewhere out there in the space, and we mistreat the mother sentient beings who are in our everyday life on a day-to-day basis. I think that's that kind of advice struck in my mind, as a kid. So, I always try to remember that, where you are living, where you are, as much as possible, at least try to make some difference in other, fellow human beings' lives. So I think that is a very important point. I've been asked to speak on the topic of distinctive feature of Tantra. And I know you have all gone through progressively Lamrim, mind training, Abhidhamma, taxonomy of mental factors, and basic Buddhist psychology and so on. So this is a perfect, audience. You have been all prepped well to be able to get to this point. And, so I felt that at this point, sharing some of my understanding of what makes Tantra unique, what makes Tantra distinctive would be helpful. Because those of you who have been exposed to Tibetan Buddhism, many of you know that, one of the unique aspects of the Tibetan tradition is the Vajrayana dimension, is Tantra. We do see elements of it in Japan, like Mikyo tradition and others, but the full-fledged tantric teachings and practices really exist in the Tibetan tradition. And that's what makes the Tibetan tradition distinct. Sometimes because of this, there seems to be a tendency, increasingly in the West, but more specifically in the East Asian, Southeast Asian countries like Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, where they are exposed to many different Buddhist traditions, to somehow categorize Tibetan as Vajrayana Buddhism, Chinese tradition as Mahayana Buddhism, and then Theravada tradition. This characterization is little inaccurate from the Tibetan perspective. Really, the Tibetan tradition sees itself as a union of Sutra and Tantra. That's a big, important phrase. Donga Sung Del, all four schools of Tibetan tradition, as well as Chonang, if you don't include Chonang within the four school, would all, explicitly state that our path is a union of Sutra and Tantra. So to characterize the entirety of the tradition as Vajrayana really isn't that accurate. So the way in which the Tibetan tradition sees its path is really a kind of a comprehensive presence of teachings all the way from what the Tibetan tradition would refer to as the foundational practices that are in Vinaya, that are in morality, that are in the 37 aspects of the path to enlightenment, the Four Noble Truths, which are teachings that we tend to find quite extensively presented in the Theravada texts, suttas. That forms the basis. And in addition, then there is the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal, which is framed in the practice of the six perfections, and then four means of, helping others. So the 6 perfections is part of your own personal development on the Mahayana path. And then comes Tantra. So really the tradition, all 4 or 5 major Tibetan traditions really see their path as a comprehensive integration of all of these. So those who are familiar with the Lamdam literature will know that we talk about foundational paths and Vajrayana path. So to get into Vajrayana, we are supposed to have been trained first in the foundational paths. Many of those who are familiar with the Gelug tradition will know one of the important daily practices the monastics do is the Lama Chopa, which is offerings to the Guru. And the final part of that text gives you a total overview of the entire path, starting from, reliance on a proper reliance on a guru, all the way up to the, completion stage and union of Tantra. So you can see there the kind of the vision of the path. So now, of course, part of that is the Tantra. And there is unanimity among all the Tibetan traditions, the acknowledgement that Vajrayana path is the swift path. In some ways, Vajrayana path is the highest path. It's the most advanced path. And, phrases like swift path and one of the things that makes Vajrayana distinctive is what is called taking the result on the path. So there is this idea that in non-Vajrayana teachings, there is a kind of a much greater emphasis on linearity. So you have the ground, you have the path, then you have the result. And you can only bring result onto the path in the form of an aspiration, making an aspiration to attain it towards the end. Whereas in Vajrayana, a very important aspect of it is to really find techniques and practices that would bring actually the resultant aspect of the result into the path. Hence, in the sadhana, death meditation on Dharmakaya, the 3 kaya Buddha bodies practice is a way of bringing result onto the path. Another thing that makes Vajrayana quite distinctive is that in non-Vajrayana Buddhist teachings and the practice, a large part of the emphasis is on training the mind. And the training the mind primarily at the level of what one could call the intellect, the rational mind. So you have the emotional side like bodhicitta, compassion, those are trained. And then on the wisdom side, it's really more the rational cognition, an understanding of reality, impermanence, no self, all of this. So in the non-Vajrayana teachings and practices, there's very little role for emotions as part of the path. If anything, the attitude toward emotions generally tend to be more on the negative side in the non-Vajrayana teachings, like attachment, anger. These are to be suppressed. These are to be countered. These are to be eliminated. In Vajrayana, the tone and the approach completely shifts. And even the attitude shifts. Now the emotions like attachment, anger, jealousy, all of these can be brought into the path. And the way in which it is done is to tap into the energy of these emotions. Because one of the things that we know from personal experience is that the power of the experience of a simple thought, rational thought like calculating 2 + 2 is 4, versus a strong emotional experience, we know the power is completely different. And so the energy that emotion brings is a powerful energy. In the non-Vajrayana teachings and practices, there isn't any particular technique that enables us to tap into that energy and utilize on the path. That is also what makes, again, Vajrayana approach very distinct. Another important difference is that in non-Vajrayana path, other than adopting an body posture for the right meditation to allow your mind to be alert, by keeping your spine straight and breathing and focusing on the breath to calm down, using breath as an anchor. Beyond that, there's very little role for the physiological elements to play as part, to be utilized as part of a path, as a technique. In Vajrayana, again, it's very different. In Vajrayana, because of the pranayama, vast breath practices, there's a lot of techniques that actually tap into the power of the body, the physiological elements. So you can see that, and these are the reasons why Vajrayana is really seen as, more advanced and more swift, because in some sense, to put it in plain English, Vajrayana is using everything, every important part of who we are as human beings as a means on the path. Whereas in the non-Vajrayana path, we're using mainly our mind. And another very important feature of Vajrayana is the idea of subtle consciousness. In non-Vajrayana teachings, one could speak of levels of subtlety based on how tuned your attention is, the 4 jhanas, the 4 levels of concentration and so on and so forth. There is certain level of subtlety among them because you cancel out the noise as you fine-tune your attention, because it turns out, and even modern research shows that the power of attention comes not so much from squeezing your attention and forcing it, but the skill with which you are able to cancel out all the noises that are distracting. And this is exactly how it is described in the meditation manuals. And, so these are, and in fact, if you look at the meditation manuals on shamatha practice, bliss is a very important quality of that mind, because as you learn to cancel out the noise, those of you who have used canceling out headphones on the plane, it brings a peace, because what it does is it cancels out all the noises that could otherwise be annoying or distracting. So the shamatha meditation is, in some ways, it is a form of that. It's a form of canceling out all the energy that gets dissipated because of our distraction. So because of this, a bliss, type of experience of bliss arises naturally. So those are levels of subtlety, but those levels of subtlety are very different from the kind of subtle consciousness that the Vajrayana speaks about. Vajrayana subtle consciousness has nothing to do with fine-tuning your attention, whereas a non-Vajrayana subtlety, degrees of subtlety of mind has everything to do with the fine-tuning of attention and to what extent you are able to, without using too much effort, pay attention and cancel out all the distractions. The Vajrayana subtle consciousness has really to do with the vayu, the wind, the prana or the wind. And the understanding again here is that, mind and body at the subtlest level, which is mind, the consciousness and wind, are inseparable. It's an indivisible single entity. So there is this idea that in non-Vajrayana teachings, particularly in the sutras, body and mind are really seen as very distinct from each other. And in fact, a large part of the Buddhist argument to prove, future existence, rebirth, is contingent upon the mind, the consciousness being immaterial and not contingent on the body, and which makes perfect sense. But Vajrayana would argue that in the final analysis, at the subtlest level, consciousness cannot be separated from body in the final sense, the subtle body. So the subtle mind that is, being used in Vajrayana is that subtle mind that is, conjoined with the subtle energy. And that kind of subtle mind can only be generated if we are able to use our body to dissolve certain activities of the wind to experience entry of wind into the central channel. So, and that is a very important part of the Vajrayana, which you don't see in Tantra, non-Vajrayana sources at all. So those are really what makes Vajrayana very distinct, but one could also see Vajrayana as a continuation of the same Buddhist teaching. You know, really, because right from the beginning in the sutra, we see Buddha being very explicit in saying that the nature of mind is luminous, nature of mind is clear light. All the afflictions that taint the mind are incidental and they are removable. So the actual quality of the mind itself is pure. Pure not in the sense of being a Buddha, but pure in the sense of not being tainted. So those basic ideas are there. And there's also the idea in the non-Vajrayana sources about how, you know, ultimately enlightenment is a function of a state of mind. You know, there's, you know, beautiful lines which says that, you know, when you see the truth, you're enlightened. And when you are ignorant of the truth, you're in samsara. That's a very broadly put, but it's essentially nirvana and samsara is a state of mind. It's not like some special place we are going to go to. So those are basic Buddhist teachings, which we see in the Theravada teachings, in the Sutra teachings. And what Vajrayana is doing is to really kind of build on that. So we should not see that somehow Vajrayana is bringing a kind of you know, there's a kind of a disconnect there. Somehow there's a kind of a big jump. You know, really the Tibetan tradition sees Vajrayana techniques and teachings as a development. And also, for example, like the teachings on the clear light in Vajrayana tradition are really seen as the full-fledged development of the teachings on the Buddha nature, which is the key topic in the third turning of the wheel of Dharma. Because in the, you know, in the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, the main focus is the objective clear light, which is emptiness. And in the third turning, you know, then the emphasis shifts to the subject. Now, in non-Vajrayana sources, the subject is not referred to as clear light because that's a tantric Vajrayana language. But the kernel of that idea of, you know, the emphasis on the subject is already there in the third turning of the wheel. And we also know from the discourse on Buddha nature, a kernel of the idea of Buddha nature is the idea that the essential nature of our mind is pure. And mind has the potential to attain omniscient state. So, and the path, the enlightenment path to enlightenment is really a journey which involves two aspects. One is to, you know, progressively removing the layers and layers of afflictions and obscurations that cover this essential purity. And the other one is a more sort of, you know, proactive approach of cultivating the more enlightened qualities like compassion, wisdom, and so on. So there's a kind of a two-pronged approach. And so in the non-Vajrayana teachings, the Buddha nature is understood primarily in the form of the emptiness of the mind. So whereas in Vajrayana, the Buddha nature is also understood in terms of this subtle consciousness, which we all have. And so it's a sort of, again, there's a further expansion on the teaching on the Buddha nature, and which is connected to this subjective clear light, which is the, you know, the clear light mind. And this clear light mind is really sometimes referred to as the innate nature. In some translations, it is also translated as the primordial consciousness. And the idea here is that it's ever present, and it is pure, it is untainted, because that is the ultimate essential nature of our consciousness. So what Vajrayana practices are trying to do is to find a way to awaken that in us. Now, it's of course a simple idea, but it's a mighty hard task. So this is why Vajrayana is one area where there's a lot more devotional element. You can go through the whole Theravada practice, and I would also argue probably the Sutra practice without too much devotion, because a lot of them are training of the mind, it's understanding the nature of reality, enhancing your compassion. But in Vajrayana, devotion becomes a very important part of your practice. And the idea here is, and this is a tricky one, because unfortunately, sometimes that aspect of the tradition gets abused because it insists on a certain relationship between teacher and student. And here, one thing that is helpful is to understand why the importance of devotion. And also to understand that it's not so much a devotion to a particular person, but it's more to the devotion to the ideal of that relationship. It's a tough thing to remember, because what we are doing here is that the one thing that we do know is that when we chant and when we are moved, even when you're reading poetry or listening to a beautiful music, when we are moved, we know there is a quietness, there's a stillness in the mind, there's a kind of a tenderness in us, which makes us very receptive. And that is what is happening in the Vajrayana practice. What we are trying to do through the guru-disciple relationship, and also reading the biographies of the great siddhas of the past, we're really trying to tap into that part of us. And also the beautiful part of the devotional approach is that it allows us to submit. I mean, again, it's a difficult word, because again, submission is a word that is probably antithetical to the Western culture of, not paying too much attention to hierarchy and all the rest. But we also know that submission, it's not so much the submission of you as a person, but it's really letting go of your ego. And so that's why in Vajrayana, right from the beginning, Vajrayana, practice, requires an empowerment, an initiation. And that initiation's role is to take us to that place where we can let go of the ego, where we can really bring that devotional part from us. And also the initiation is one of the key roles of the initiation is to awaken in us that Buddha nature, that seeds for the 4 Buddha Kayas. That's why there are 4 empowerments in the highest yoga tantra. So there is there's a kind of a ritual that is part of the tradition, and the idea is to, in some sense, in the empowerment itself, Guru is guiding you through the stages that you are supposed to experience when you practice. So you go through the full initiation, empowerment process. You go through, you are empowered to do X, Y, and Z. So a powerful initiation would actually involve, the Guru guiding you through these distinct stages. So in some sense, it's like a kind of a simulation of the experiences that you are supposed to experience later as a result of practice. And so after the initiation, then the idea is initially you pay a lot of attention to making sure that you observe the vows and commitments you have made at the initiation, because what you are doing by adopting a particular meditation deity is to basically declare that I'm going to take this particular meditation deity sadhana as my principal practice. So in some sense, you are declaring your loyalty to this particular practice. So it is important to, understand, for example, if you're doing Vajrayogini practice, it's helpful to at least do a little bit of reading around the whole Vajrayogini myth. I mean, I'm using myth in a much more positive sense, in the sense of a narrative, not in the sense of, myth versus reality. That's a separate issue. But the myth is a better word because it's the narrative around Vajrayogini, which inspires you, which speaks to you. So I think it's, therefore Vajrayana practice has these elements which are very, very different from general sutra practice, sutra approach. And when they work, they are powerful. I mean, that's what makes them very powerful. And if you look at these sadhana practices, because the daily practice is really framed within a sadhana. And sadhana is, literally means of attainment, but it's essentially a manual for generating yourself into that particular deity, adopting the identity, and going through simulation of the enlightened activities of that enlightened deity. And then a good sadhana practice would also involve at the end a very brief reviewing of the completion stage practice. So even when you start your practice, instead of waiting for completion stage until you go through the whole generation stage, which may take a lot of time, you start familiarizing yourself with the completion stage in the form of at least a series of verses and aspirational prayer. So it's in this way. So what you're doing is, so some of you may actually have a sadhana practice. If you look at the sadhana practice, the framework is actually quite powerful. Within that short practice, you basically have the entirety of the Buddhist path, starting with going for refuge, reinforcing your bodhicitta, reinforcing your immeasurable thoughts, then doing a guru yoga practice, which is your reinforcing your relationship with your guru who has initiated you, and then generating yourself as a deity and reciting the mantra, which is a way of approximating, becoming closer to that deity. And then in the end, you do a brief meditation and do the, completion stage in the form of an aspiration. So within a sadhana, you have the complete approach, quite powerful. And the sadhana, in Tibet, the tradition is that everybody takes tons of initiations. But the smart, the lamas who are custodians of the lineages, they have no choice. They really have to take hundreds and hundreds of empowerments because they need to keep the lineage and the transmission alive. But we who do not have any ambitions to be custodians of the lineages, we don't need to take all the initiations. So the smart thing is to choose one meditation deity, do take initiation of several deities, but concentrate your own daily practice on one. So there is this, famous saying, Atisha criticizing his Tibetan disciples, saying that in India, the smart yogis choose one deity and they accomplish all the other deities. In Tibet, everybody chooses hundreds of deities, but nobody seems to accomplish even one. So I think Atisha really has a point. So the main thing is to find a deity that you can resonate. And I think, some of the lamas and geshes might find it a little horrifying to hear this word, but you need to make an emotional connection with the meditation deity you have chosen. You really have to feel that connection. So if that means trying out several practices, so be it. And then also, as much as possible, you should also read some of the narratives, the myths around that particular practice, because all of these main meditation deity sadhanas have really evolved on the basis of a yogi's vision. All of them have really evolved on the basis of a yogi's vision. And by choosing that particular deity and sadhana, we are basically signing up to be part of that lineage. So clearly you need to feel emotional connection with that particular tradition. The stories of the great masters of that tradition has to ring true to you. So I think this is where I think, emotional connection may be not the thing that you would, expect a Geshe to be talking in the context of relating to a meditation deity, but that's what it is, because it has to move you. It has to inspire you. You need to feel at home with this, this archetype that you have chosen to be the focus of your main focus of your practice. And if you're able to do this, then the Vajrayana is a beautiful, beautiful path, because it has this sort of simplicity and sort of the succinctness of the framework, especially if you use a sadhana. And then, of course, every now and then, if you need to spend a bit more time on bodhicitta, we have the option to do it. But by doing the sadhana on a daily basis, you have, as the Tibetan Lama says, that even if you don't gain great realizations in this life, at least you would have imprinted lots of good karmas. So I think that's, in some ways it's a simple idea, but on the other hand, it's also a powerful idea that if we can imprint. So I think those are, some of the ways in which Vajrayana is truly distinct. And also because of these reasons, in Vajrayana, you hear the phrase, Siji Lujila Sangyeva, attaining Buddhahood in a single lifetime. And the Tibetan tradition has examples of Milarepa, everybody knows. And in the Gelug tradition, Wensapa, Losang Tendrup, is really seen, recognized widely as having attained Buddhahood in a single lifetime. So, and if you don't understand what makes Vajrayana approach unique and in what ways, but your understanding has to be developed in a way that you don't see it as completely different from the mainstream Mahayana path. Because in the end, as Tsongkhapa and Sakya Pandita says, that there's only one emptiness. Vajrayana doesn't reveal a truth higher than emptiness. Emptiness is the same emptiness. Where Vajrayana differs is the techniques and the method for realizing emptiness, and particularly the state of mind, the level of mind, consciousness that you are using to realize emptiness. And in Vajrayana, it's the subtle mind. It's the subtle mind, and that subtle mind ultimately is a state of mind that is completely non-dual, that has arisen as a result of having dissolved all thoughts and all perceptions of duality. And that kind of subtle mind consciousness can only arise through a process of dissolution. And this is one of the reasons why in Vajrayana practices, we also use sexual imagery, because sexual experience, one of the characteristics of sexual experience is this ability to completely, eclipse your individual ego. So there is a kind of a totality of that, sort of dissolution of the duality. And it's a powerful state of mind. And also the subtlest level of consciousness is understood to be characterized by the tone of bliss. So that's why it's referred to as the innate bliss. It's not a bliss that you have to cultivate. It's a bliss that you have to unlock. It's a natural bliss which is already there, but that requires unlocking it. And then the highest and deepest level of bliss is referred to as the innate bliss. And when you are able to utilize that innate blissful state of mind to realize emptiness, that's when enlightenment takes place. So that's why in the sadhana, the death meditation is so important, because by doing the death meditation, what we are doing is we are simulating the experience of death, at which point the subtlest level of consciousness arises. But for ordinary people like us, who are not used and trained, the subtle moment of consciousness, even though it is pure, it's an innate clear light mind and bliss, it's so powerful that we just get blacked out. Whereas the idea here is that the yogi, by doing the sadhana on a daily basis, will be able to seize that moment and maintain awareness and utilize that subtle consciousness free of all levels of conceptual elaborations to realize the truth. And this is also one of the reasons why in the Tibetan tradition, when a Lama, after dying, remains in a clear light state of mind, Thupten, it's a big deal. The idea here is that the Lama is now in a clear light state of mind. It's a big deal. So those are what makes Vajrayana really quite powerful. And also it's helpful to get a sense of how the tradition understands how these techniques work and how they ultimately connected to the foundational Buddhist teachings in the Theravada teachings and in the Sutra teachings. So with that, I'll stop, and maybe we can have some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Geshe. I'm going to just lead off with a question, and anybody who has any questions, you can put them in the chat box as I sort of ask one here. We can have, I'm happy to facilitate them. So it's often, said that there's so much danger for misuse around Tantra. I wonder if you have any recommendations about why that might be and how to avert it, and especially since there seems to be a very strong connection between scandals in the West right now with gurus and such. I know it's been on the top of our mind as a community because there's a lot of fallout of spiritual teachers, but they tend to be very oriented towards Tantra and Vajrayana. So I wonder if you have some comments on that, Geshe. Thank you.
Well, there are a couple of areas where Vajrayana can potentially be abused. One is the devotional element of teacher and disciple. And again here, the onus really rests upon the teacher. Because if the teacher starts to believe, it's one thing for the disciples to view their guru in the light of being enlightened, because the spirit of the guru is enlightened. But it is something else for the guru himself or herself start believing that to be factually true. That can lead to all sorts of problems. So here, I think the basic teaching on humility and self-critical inquiry really it's so important. So I think the devotional element is an important one because, in Tibetan literature, if you look at Milarepa's devotion to Marpa, his teacher, and the amount of test he was subjected to, we cannot expect that kind of, devotionality in this particular culture and in this era. And also on the part of the student too, I think it's important to be able to differentiate that when you are bringing devotion, it's not really to the person who's the guru. It's really what the guru represents, which is the teaching, which is the spirit of the guru, And I think those kind of, being able to distinguish, that's very important, because otherwise, there's a danger that because, if you look at some of the literature in the Tibetan tradition without any interpretive glasses, if you read them, they're pretty scary, and if you imagine, if you take them at their face value, and then once you have, taken a initiation from a Lama, then you have created the Vajra bond, and you cannot break that Samaya. You break the Samaya, you go to hell. And then you're supposed to basically offer everything that you possess to the Guru. All of this, if you read them literally, and if the Guru expects them literally, you're in big trouble. So that's one area of potential. So this is why I think the approach, even when Tantra, trying to at least establish some basic understanding of why Tantra, why devotion, then you will be able to situate your practice within a broader context. So I think that's the best deterrent against potential abuse. The other one is, again, in Tantra, particularly the highest yoga Tantra, there is a lot of sexual symbolism. Even in the depiction on the Tantras, the deities in union. So it's very obvious. So clearly we cannot sort of wash it away and pretend it's not there. But again, here it's important to remember that the utilization of sexual energy presupposes that you have certain basic qualifications, and so therefore I think, just again here it's the knowledge, understanding what role this plays and why sexual imagery, so I think being able to understand this so that you don't find yourselves in a position where Guru starts to abuse you, someone who is not responsible. That I think is one area. And the other area is more practical. For example, like as you advance into the completion stage practice, like Tummo meditation, then you are using physiological elements through the prana and the chakra. And depending on your constitution of the body, sometimes some of these meditation, visualization that focus specifically like around the heart area could lead to complications. So, and then also the vast breath meditation where you hold the breath at your navel level and then use that as the springboard to continue to do the Vajrayana recitation. Some of these can have physiological side effects. So when you get to those stages, I think it's very important to be guided by ideally someone who has those experiences, but at least someone who understands and can read the text and identify which are the problems. So those are more practical, problems. If you look at, for example, like when you do the mantra repetition, some of them involve focusing around the heart area. And this is really seen as sometimes, for some types of people, potentially dangerous because it starts to constrict your attention and you feel stressed. So there are things like this. Again, here you need to, and this is one reason why before you do Vajrayana practice, doing some basic shamatha practice, attention training, breath practice is helpful because you begin to learn your body. You have a more clearer ability to recognize body signals. You have a, sort of a more refined somatic awareness. And if you develop that, then when you do the Vajrayana, more advanced practices, if things are not working, you will catch them fairly early. So those are potential areas which can lead to problem, yeah.
So just to follow up on that, Geshe, the question is, if you don't have a Vajra guru, if you don't have a relationship with a guru, is it possible to practice some of the lower tantras, for example, like Green Tara on your own in a self-directed way? And then what would the difference be once you have initiation, like on a mechanistic or psychological level? What would the qualitative difference be between practicing on your own, the same sadhana or the same deity, between having the relationship, not having the relationship, between having an initiation, not having an initiation?
I think the lower levels of Tantra, some of the visualization and sadhanas, I think you can do it without empowerment. I think they are very general practices. But even there, the difference between receiving empowerment and not receiving is really whether or not you are part of the continuity of that transmission of blessing. So this is where the devotional part of Vajrayana comes in. There is this idea, there's a Tibetan expression that in some texts it's quite vivid. It says that the fresh breath of Lama's blessing is still alive. The idea that somehow a living person has passed this on to another living person with a breath, you know. So there is this idea of a continuity of an unbroken, you know, mouth to ear transmission. So I think this is where, again, it's this devotional part. And this is one area where I think the Western mind will struggle a little bit because, you know, particularly in North America, you know, the larger culture is so aversive towards anything that has a tradition or hierarchy. So devotion can be, but on the other hand, I think that there is a beautiful part of devotion that is not dangerous, because that really involves letting go of your ego. It's a form of it's a highest form of humility. And the beautiful thing about the Vajrayana is that you're not doing it to any particular institution. You're doing it to this whole lineage of the Mahasiddhas, and, you know, Dakinis and great yoginis who have practiced it. So I think there is a way in which you can exercise and express your devotional mind in a way that rings true to you, that is authentic to you. And this is why I think being inspired by the stories of the great yogis and yoginis is an important part of that Vajrayana journey. I think that is, you know, it's not just stories. I think it's really, and then every now and then reading beautiful, moving verses. You know, some of the hymns to Vajrayogini, you know, or Tara, they're beautiful. You know, I mean, like, there's a beautiful one on Vajrayogini, which was written by the Sakya master, Sarjan Lose Gyatso, which is actually the version that is adopted even in the Gelug practice. You know, it's beautiful. I hope there's a beautiful English translation. These days, there's a lot of translations that are quite beautiful. So I think just being able to, and these take time. You know, you need to somehow allow them to come to you. Let this devotional part of you unfold by reading these poems, by reading these hymns, you know, reading around the narrative of Tara or Vajrayogini or, you know, Guhya Samaja, or, and then, you know, reading about some of the yogis that have played an important role in the dissemination of that transmission. Those are very distinct Vajrayana approach. You know, you don't need that in the Sutrayana path. For Vajrayana, what all of this does is to really bring your mind to that quiet, humble, letting go of ego place in a way that comes through a devotional process.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Allison and I were talking before you came about your involvement with the mind life and how you've seen in the last 30 years a lot of emphasis in research on mindfulness, and then your involvement with Stanford on compassion. And Allison and I were curious about your sort of vision for the future, if where the Vajrayana sort of path lies in the sort of investigative and adoption or integration into well-being, into science, and research.
I don't know. That's a tough one, because with the compassion and mindfulness, it's actually quite easily translatable into a secular format. Because with mindfulness, we are talking about primarily the attention regulation. And with compassion, we are talking about a fundamental human nature that everybody experiences on a day-to-day basis. and the impulse for kindness is very natural. It's biologically evolved. And of course, we bring the Buddhist tradition because the Buddhist tradition is one tradition which has a long history of interest in cultivating these in a very conscious, proactive way. So, that's one of the reasons why we are adapting from the Buddhist sources. On the Vajrayana front, I don't know. It's a tougher one because it's very, it's very difficult to see the possibility of secularization, because a lot of these research requires creation of protocols that can be, looked at, and that is more universal. And Vajrayana, again, this devotional part, and there's a kind of a more myth orientation, a subtle consciousness, emotion. It's a tough one. But there's some of the techniques of Vajrayana where, for example, like the visualization ones, which uses different colors as a tone of emotion. I think there may be certain specific aspects of the Vajrayana techniques that could be used, because in the tradition too, we used visualization of nectars and lights of different color as a part of a healing practice. So those, I think, some of these very specific aspects of the techniques can be, universalizable, secularized, and then studied. But I don't know. Vajrayana is a tough one. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Wim Hof?
Yes. Yeah.
So it seems there it's a very close to Tummo practice in some way, or some use of pranayama to override the autonomic nervous system. But in another way, it's been stripped of its sort of cultural trappings. True. So I wonder if that may be, if you have an opinion on that. And
I think
what might get lost.
Yeah.
If that ritual is taken.
I think those specific types of techniques will be adopted. I think that's the one of the interesting thing about our time is the democratization of knowledge and insights. So nothing will stop people from kind of looking into these resources and see if it can be adapted. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong, because in the end, Buddha is famously quoted in the Theravada Sutta as saying, "I have taught only one thing and one thing only, elevation of suffering." so if that was the original spirit of the Buddha, we Buddhists shouldn't be complaining if any of the Buddhist techniques are adopted more universally to help people. But the Vajrayana itself, probably there will be some cultural changes. As a result of cultural changes, certain forms of the Vajrayana practice may adapt and change. For example, like the guru devotion part, that probably needs to be changed, and that probably also needs to be much more nuanced and much more explicitly explained why it's there, so that there is less potential for abuse. So I think my feeling is that if Vajrayana is really going to be successfully transplanted in the Western contemporary culture and society, it probably needs to go through some cultural translation. And those cultural translations are best done by people like yourself, Miles, or Thurman, and who are part of the community, part of the society, who have a deep knowledge and understanding of the tradition itself, and so that you don't lose the essence in the process of translation. But it will need to be adapted. It will need to be, in order for it to be really successful, because it's a powerful practice, it's a powerful path. But the presentation, the form, the currently is very Tibetan, very Indo-Tibetan, and in order for it to work, it needs to ring true to you. So I think this is why it will need a sort of a cultural translation.
Geshe, I want to just thank you on behalf of the whole community, just that you agreed. It's so wonderful to hear your to hear your voice with such clarity. It's so beautiful. I really appreciate your time. We're so thankful on behalf of the whole crew here. And wish you all the best with all your ongoing activities in your hermitage. May you continue to translate for His Holiness, and may you continue to put the Dharma out in those beautiful works, classic works, so that people like us don't have to spend all the energy learning Tibetan.
That's true. Thank you. I mean, I really appreciate all of your dedication, and also on your part, helping to create this more structured approach, so that your understanding of the teachings would be placed within a broader context, and I think that's really helpful. And thank you for the questions, and good luck.
Would you be willing to just lead a little dedication of merit?
Yeah, okay. And then I will do a little chanting, and then at the end I think we could turn to right and left, and wherever we are on the Zoom screen, smile, okay? When I finished. Chanjo semjo rimboche maje panam kekyoji keba nyamba meba yam kone kondo peorasho pama simje tamje dedan tingyoji ndo tamje tato jongwada chanjo semba kana sujoba tada kunji mola tukyoji. Thank you. So we can look on right and left and wave and smile and keep safe. Yeah.
Thank you, Geshe-la.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take good care. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.